What's up, everybody, and welcome back to another video from Pink Tourmaline. And this video is a revisit of Thomas Campbell. I made a video about him a few months ago, I think, and it was prior to learning about this entire rabbit hole that I've gone down with Gnosticism, with David Icke, and this whole idea of the material world or Earth, or I don't know exactly how it all fits together, but it being some sort of a manipulation system, a system that encourages us via manipulation or other tactics to continue to reincarnate. And the reason why, or the rationale why, is because by us living here and enduring certain negative things, we emit negative emotions, and that frequency and that vibration is consumed as energy. It's called loosh, etc. So I've talked about this in a couple of videos. And where that entire theory comes from, apparently, is from Bob Monroe, the founder of the Monroe Institute, a place that I become more and more interested in. It's so crazy that so many things tie back to the Monroe Institute, a place that I learned about actually just over a year ago, and a place that I really want to go to and will go to. But so it ties back to the work that they did at the Monroe Institute and the Gateway program, which was a program that was eventually undertaken by the CIA, I believe, funded by the CIA. Don't quote me on that, but I know there's CIA, at least there's CIA documents about it. I can't say for sure who funded it, but it seems like it was under CIA control for a time being. But that is where all of these pieces come from. And I remembered Thomas Campbell looking at this interview before, because I made a video about a physicist's theory on God and the system of consciousness and whatever. And I'm like, oh my God, he was connected to Bob Monroe. And now I've learned so much since I made that video. I wanted to go back and I wanted to look at everything that he said once again with this newfound context and with this newfound information. So just to start at the top, Thomas Campbell, he is a physicist and author known for his work on consciousness and the theory of everything model. And he got a PhD in physics and a long tenure in the military, U.S. Missile Defense Research, and worked as a contractor for NASA. And then before his work in defense, he worked as a systems analyst in the U.S. Army intelligence. So this is an Army guy, a military guy, obviously highly credentialed. He has a BS and MS in physics, earned a PhD at experimental nuclear physics from University of Virginia. So this guy has had a long education. And we're going to go through some of his backgrounds, and then we're going to go back and look at two clips from this interview on the Danny Jones podcast. One that I showed before, a second one that's a little bit newer. And I want to now explain or give my take on what he's saying in these clips with this newfound context, and just sort of try and unravel it and line it up with some of these new potential theories of what could exactly be going on this planet and in this realm. So first, let's talk about that. Obviously, that background doesn't talk about the Monroe Institute and Gateway, but I want to play this clip so you guys can see the connection once again to the Monroe Institute. Again, I'd love to see more interviews and more questions about Bob Monroe himself. Sadly, there are interviews up there, but sadly he passed away in 1995, so we can't talk to him anymore. But Thomas Campbell is definitely around. And the good news is Danny Jones invited him on this podcast to come back and do another podcast. So hopefully they'll dive even deeper into the story. But check this out, just to give you context. He did indeed work with Bob Monroe for a long time.
Well, actually, my career in physics and my career in consciousness research both started at the same time. When I got out of graduate school, I went to work for actually it was Army Technical Intelligence, and that's where I started doing big computer models of complex systems, which kind of became my forte. And there, my boss tossed me Journeys Out of the Body. He said, Tom, read this and tell me what you think about it. So, when your boss tells you to read this, you do it. I did it, and I told him, I said, well, if this is legitimate and this is true, then that's really amazing.
Mm-hmm. Just to give you context, Journeys Out of the Body, that's a book written by Bob Monroe. Right now I'm reading Adventures, I think, Out of the Body, which is a book by William Bowman, but I definitely will be reading Bob Monroe's book very soon.
If it's not, and the guy's just got a good imagination, well, he's just trying to sell books, that would not be so amazing. So my boss found out that Bob Monroe didn't live that far away, and that was in Charlottesville, Virginia. So we made an appointment. We went out. Two carloads full of people, about 10 of us, we went out to meet Bob Monroe. And Bob Monroe, this was now 1971, 72, early 70s. So, yeah, I'm a lot older than I look. So we met Bob, and he had just built a lab for studying consciousness. It was just an empty building. And he said, I'm looking for some scientists to help me study consciousness in the lab. So I volunteered, and a friend of mine, Dennis Menerick, volunteered. And about 3 weeks after that, we started going out to the lab, and we were still doing that 7 to 8 years later. So I spent probably 15 to 20 hours a week with Bob Monroe for about 7.5 years.
Doing what? What kind of stuff were you doing?
Well, first off, he taught us how to go out of body. That was the first thing, because we didn't want to study consciousness from outside. We needed to study it from inside. Mm-hmm. So he taught us, out of body.
Another thing that's interesting later on in this clip, in this video that I didn't include in this clip, is that he wanted to be sure that it was working and not just his imagination running wild or some sort of manipulation or something that was being done to him to make him think he was going out of body. So what they would do is they would do something called remote viewing, which I've talked about as well on this channel, a little bit different, nuanced compared to astral projection, but almost like where you're projecting your consciousness to see something that's not physically near you or anywhere in your vicinity. And he said they used remote viewing tests as a way to verify that they were actually truly projecting their consciousness or projecting their spirit body outside of the body, because they would go to certain locations and recite numbers back that knew were placed in certain locations, something like this, right? They'd relay data that they could only know if they were truly projecting their consciousness to a specific physical location and time. So that's how Bob Monroe gained his trust, and he realized, wait, what he's teaching us and what we're doing, this is not just mind games and mental tricks. Like, we're actually doing this. Very interesting. Okay, now we're going to get to the clip that I played before of what happens when we die. And again, when I first listened to this, I was purely in the realm. I hadn't stumbled across David Icke and all these other folks, Bob Monroe and different things. I was purely in the mindset of near-death experiences, tell the whole story, and that's it. And so I was looking at it from that vantage point. I didn't know any of this other bits of information or about this idea that some of these remote viewing processes is what created a lot of these theories about Loosh and about this system basically recycling souls for a nefarious purpose, as opposed to being a system of learning and growth. So I'm going to play this clip, and then we'll chop it up now that I have some more context on some possible other theories.
What happens when we die?
That's an easy question. I know that's the hard question, but that's really the easy question. And first, let me tell you how I know, because how do you know what happens when you die? Well, I know from several approaches. One, it's easy to do a mind-to-mind connection with somebody and then just follow along with them. So you see, hear, smell, and taste what they see, hear, smell, and taste.
This is kind of exactly what was talked about in that video that I made last night about the white light trap, that this is how this information was learned. It was basically by some sort of remote viewing at the moment of death. So he's kind of saying it in different words, not exactly in those words, but saying attaching to the consciousness and then observing what that person is observing, feeling, sensing at the moment of death. Very, very interesting.
And it's just a mind-to-mind connection. Yeah. What was it? Spock used to do that with the fingers on the head, right? He'd do a mind meld. Well, it's kind of like that. It's but not quite so showy.
You're tapping into somebody else.
Yeah, you attach it into somebody else's mind. Yeah. So you're just an observer. You're sitting there observing what they're doing.
Right.
And I've done that 2 or 3 times with people as they died.
Wow.
And you can just attach to them, and then you can go with them and see where it goes. And then you go through.
You were there while they died.
Yeah. You just attach to their consciousness. It's what you're attaching to, their consciousness. The body dies, the consciousness doesn't. So when they die, you're with their consciousness, and you can follow that process that they go through. And that's one way that I learned. The other way was that a long, long time ago, the larger conscious system gave me a job in the virtual reality frame I call the transition reality.
So he mentions this, the larger consciousness system. What is that? Is that just a description of God? And I think that's how I interpreted the first time I listened to this clip. And now, I mean, it could be that. I also wonder if that could be a reference, knowingly or unknowingly, to this archonic system that's described by David Icke and by Gnosticism. You know, when he says the consciousness system, maybe he's only talking about the system that he's able to witness or examine that is housing or encasing this realm or this planet or whatever, however far it extends. You know, so I don't know. I think in this video he said God is a consciousness system at some point, so maybe he is referring to God. But like I said, that thought didn't even cross my mind before. Now I'm wondering. And when he talks about this time where he was invited by the consciousness system to witness this or to be like a greeter, is what he's going to say. You know, that's what I'm kind of wondering if there are indeed entities that are calling us after we pass on and trying to get us to enter the light or do these different things or whatever. Was he enlisted or enrolled somehow in that system? Again, I don't know. And now he's come to believe that that's the entirety of the system or the consciousness system, whereas he was only seeing a sliver of it that they wanted him to see, right? Like these are just questions I have. I have no idea what the truth is, but just wanted to fill in that context as a good comparative note from the last video to this one.
And that's where you end up after your avatar dies. And it's there for a transition. And I was there just to learn what it was like. I was like a Walmart greeter. You know, the people would die and they would come there and I would say, "Yeah, come up this way. It's fine. Everything's going to be all right." And I was doing that for a while, and I got around to the various places and stations. And so I spent probably, I don't know, months where every night I had entities come to me when I was very young, like 7 years old. They taught me how to go out of body, and they taught me a lot of other things too, how to get around in the non-physical. So I had all that happen to me at a young age. And
one thing that I just realized, which is interesting to note, I'm not trying to discredit his story by any means, but he said that was happening at I'm just have to point it out. He said that was happening at a young age and entities taught him to go out of body at a young age, but then they went with Bob Monroe as an adult and was taught again how to go out of body, or maybe he forgot to go out of body or how to go out of body as he grew up, perhaps, and then maybe he remembered these experiences later. I don't know. But I think it's an interesting thing to point out. I'd love to see another interview of Thomas Campbell to see if we could dive deeper into why that is. You know, why, if he was doing it at a young age as a child and having these experiences, why did he question it when Bob Monroe wrote that book and he read it? And why did he need Bob Monroe to train him over that 7.5-year period if he had already been doing it? It could be that, though. It could be, you know, I'm just trying to, I don't know, but that's a good question to ask. What did it simply come from the fact that you forgot as you grew up, or you let those memories go, and now they've come back to you as you open that part of your brain up again, or your consciousness up again? I think it's a fair question. I'd love to see Danny Jones have him back on and just ask him about that.
Had, you know, non-physical friends forever, and I still do. Some of the ones I interacted with when I was 7, I still interact with them. So that's been a constant. But anyway, the system sent me to this transition reality so that I would understand what happens when you die. And I worked there for probably a month. Every night I'd lie down, and as soon as I hit the bed and shut my eyes, I was gone, and I was there. And I did that every night until I learned everything that was there. So I've seen it from the death and the process and the transition, and then I've seen it from the other side where that transition comes to the transition reality and goes through the process of finding another avatar and going back.
So it's sort of like the idea of reincarnation. So our consciousness gets shuttled into another avatar.
Yeah.
And born, like when a baby is born, does it enter?
Doesn't have to be when it's born. It can be, mostly it is before. Once the baby has sensory organs, it can see, it can hear, it can smell, it can taste, then that's when a consciousness can go there and see, hear, smell, and taste those things from those sensory.
It's interesting because they talk about this in Journey of Souls. They say that it's around that time in the accounts from Journey of Souls, like 5 months or something, when the souls or entities or whatever, they enter the bodies in the womb. And I think they even say in Journey of Souls that sometimes you can come in and you can leave. They can go in and out of the body very easily at that time before the baby's actually like physically born. So that lines up with the accounts in Journey of Souls. Very interesting. I have so many questions too, because if that's the case, then what about, because I do believe people have said that plants, animals do have souls as well, that same type of energy. But then when he's saying the soul doesn't enter until there is an ability to sense, an ability to perceive via the five senses or whatever it may be, depending on the species or animal, then that begs the question, would life without sensory organs, amoebas, other single celled, viruses, those types of things, is that just pure machinery without the consciousness energy? I don't know, but I think that would be a really interesting question. Like, I'd love to ask Thomas Campbell his thoughts on that question, and where is the line drawn? What types of complexity is required biologically for a consciousness system to enter that vehicle? Oh, I think that was the end of the clip. Okay, so moving on. The next part that I wanted to, the last clip that I wanted to show you guys, it had a very interesting story that talks about a soul, spirit, whatever you want to call it, that planned to enter a body of a child that had a severe physical ailment, brain cancer, and then turned around and decided they didn't want to go into that body. And it brings up a really interesting point, this idea of free will ultimately being in our hands, us ultimately having the choice of whether or not to incarnate again, reincarnate, go into a particular situation. And I thought that was very interesting because this doesn't line up, I feel, with Journey of Souls, with a lot of these NDE accounts. And I think also ultimately, same thing, it lines up with the paradigms described in Gnosticism and David Icke. I just think free will seems to come up over and over, that ultimately we do have the choice and we do have a say. We may not always think we do, or we may get manipulated into doing certain things, but ultimately we have ultimate power and control over our fate and destiny in these different lives. So I thought this was a really cool point. I didn't include in the first video. I'm going to include it here. Let's check this out.
Went to the babe. I saw the brain cancer, and I healed the brain cancer. And brain cancer then disappeared. And another entity came, wasn't the first entity, but another entity came that was willing to take that on. And then the healing took place after that other entity came. And so it actually got a second, you want to call it consciousness, spirit, soul, whatever you want to call it. So the first one got replaced because it didn't back out. Now, that brings up a point, is free will does not get run over. If you say no, if they say, well, do you want to take this body? You can say no, and they won't force you. You're not forced to do anything.
How do you know that happened? Like, how do you know that this entity entered the baby and then did a U-turn and left, and then something else came in?
Because when I log on, I look at the whole situation. When I get into it, I get there and I see what's going on, what happened. Mm-hmm. And I talk to the entity that was the baby then. I talk to that entity, that consciousness, and that consciousness was up in a whip because it didn't want that. And then I kind of asked the system, what do you want to do here? There seems to be a problem. And the system said, give me a moment. And I was, so I work all that out. Like if you came and told me that, my mother is ill, can I help? Don't just go and help with that problem. I have to go connect with your mother, find out what the problem is, why the problem is, where did it come from? Why is she having that problem? And then I can decide whether I should heal it or not, because sometimes the problems people have are part of their learning experience. They need to have those problems. It gives them choices. to have. So sometimes it's because they've had a lifetime of anger and stuff, and it's built up, negative stuff in the body is now expressing all that anger in terms of a cancer.
Yeah.
In which case, you don't mess with it. You say, "No, I'll let that one be." It's what they need to experience. They need to experience the consequences of the way they've been. But other times, I'll find out that, it's just, yes, this would be a good candidate to heal. That's a good.
That last part is very interesting. So of course we have this idea reiterated of free will, which is a positive thing to remember, because I feel like that's empowering for all of us to recognize. But then he goes back to the narrative when he talks about sometimes you heal these ailments if you can, and sometimes you leave it be because it's important according to the system. Again, is he talking about the all-knowing source, God, or is he talking about the system, the archonic system? I don't know. But he goes back to this idea of sometimes you just got to let things play out because they need to learn that lesson. This goes back to the classic NDE narrative that I was all into prior to a couple months ago, that life is a school, that we're here to learn and we're here to grow through trials and tribulations. And that seems to be the whole point, to spiritually evolve, which I've kind of grown a little wary of that narrative the more and more I've thought about it, from all the comments and from all the subsequent research I've done. One of the biggest things that people keep bringing up is, then why is there a memory wipe? Why do you have this amnesia? Why do you not remember? And you keep being entered into the planet as tabula rasa. How does that prove as a learning vehicle, an effective learning vehicle? It instead intuitively seems like it's designed to make you go through a lot of these same mistakes over and over, just as a cycle of maybe extracting this energy, extracting this loosh, right? As opposed to truly being a learning vehicle. But maybe there's something beyond that. Maybe it still could be a learning vehicle in a way that we don't know or recognize, or maybe there is some level of memory beyond the conscious and the subconscious that does stay with us. So it could work like that. I don't know. But either way, I thought it was very interesting that he talks about it in that same way that a lot of the new age spirituality folks will talk about life as a learning vehicle, as a learning lesson. Is that because it is true? Is that because this system that he's been interacting with since he was a kid was the archonic system and he was told that, but it's actually not the truth and it's more of the manipulation? I don't know. But I felt like I had to go back and revisit this and look at this because it raises more questions. Probably raises more questions than it answers, to be honest. But I really want to go back and look at this one more time. And I really hope Danny Jones has him back on. And I'd love to hear them talk about these different theories of Gnosticism and some of these some of the other accounts of folks in these programs. Just go into a lot more detail of what he did with Bob Monroe. What are some of the things that they saw and they witnessed when they attached to consciousness? Like, just go into a lot more detail, not only of his accounts, but maybe of some of his colleagues. This guy, while he's around here, he's probably a wealth of knowledge and information. So hopefully he will be back soon. The interview was 5 months ago, so let's see if he returns. There it is. That's what I got. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. What do you think of these accounts? What do you think of that? The fact that I pointed out that weird little, maybe it's not a big deal, but that slight inconsistency where he says he had to be trained by Bob Monroe to go out of the body. But then he says when he was a kid, he was going out of the body all the time. What do you make of some of these stories that he says? What do you make of his description of everything as a consciousness system, and still talking within that framework of perhaps life being a lesson and a learning vehicle? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, please, everybody, because you guys have been helping me so much on this journey, so much more than I would have ever even imagined. I've got like 10 books that are on their way right now that have all been recommended by different folks on this channel in the comment section. So thank you everybody once again for joining. Let me know your thoughts as well, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Take it easy.